Welcome. In this video, we'll talk about the first step in finding the base flood elevation, or BFE, on FEMA floodplain maps. That is determining the type of FEMA map and zone that you have. But first, let's take a step back and explain BFEs. Base flood elevations, or BFEs, are what FEMA calls the elevations of the 1% annual chance flood. They are often called the 100-year flood because they have a 1% chance of happening any given year, or once every 100 years on average. And they are also called the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA, when lenders or agents are talking about flood insurance and mandatory flood insurance. Another phrase we'll hear for that 100-year or the that 1% annual chance flood area is the high flood risk area. And in Minnesota law, it's called the regional flood area. So there are 4 categories of FEMA mapped riverine and lake floodplain. So we'll divide it into detailed studies where we have Zone AE and approximate areas that are called Zone A. And in both cases, we'll have lakes and watercourses. So we'll have the detailed study lakes, detailed study watercourses, approximate zone lakes, approximate zone watercourses. Now that E in Zone AE stands for elevations that are shown on the FEMA maps. Those base flood elevations that we're talking about are actually shown on the FEMA maps, whereas on A-zone maps, they don't show the elevations. Note that on the older FEMA maps, those from the 70s and early 80s, instead of AE zones, they're called A with a number 1 to 30. There are some other FEMA zones that we won't get into detail in our series, but we want to mention so you're aware of these other zones. We have the coastal zones, which are called velocity zones or V zones. And we'll have the approximate ones where it just says V zones. And we have detailed ones, the VE zones, where we have elevations on the FEMA map, like in this digital map example where we show 2 different VE zones with that white line separating that VE zone and showing different elevations for the base flood elevation. The other type of zone we might see is an AO zone, which is basically overland or sheet flow areas. And in that case, FEMA will show a depth in parentheses below the AO zone label here. It'll be a depth of 1 feet, 2 feet, or 3 feet. This is an example on an older paper map, and this is an example on a newer digital map. And here you can see it's got that white line again, separating the 3-foot depth from the 2-foot depth areas. And then the AH zones, or ponded areas, they will show with that Zone AH, and they will show in parentheses the base flood elevation to the nearest foot. These are more commonly seen in Minnesota in the northwest part of the state, in the Red River Valley, in some of the areas where it's very flat, and the roads are basically higher than the area within the roads, and there's storage below the roads. Again, this series will focus on the A and AE riverine zones. So let's look at the modern maps, the digital maps. The first of the digital maps had these aqua dots here, these blue dots. And then the more recent digital maps show the A zone just with this solid blue color. Here's a lake example, and then here's a watercourse example. In both cases, they'll show the Zone A. And these light blue areas, or the aqua dots, are that 1% annual chance flood, or that 100-year flood. but they won't show the base flood elevations in the approximate areas. For the detailed study on the more modern maps, the first of the digital maps again had these blue dots, and then more recent ones are the solid blue. And here's a lake example and a watercourse example. So again, on the lake example, it'll show the AE and it'll show a rounded number for the base flood elevation on the lake. And in the video on lakes in detailed study areas, we'll talk more about how to get the exact number you need to the nearest tenth of a foot. On the watercourses, you will see in many cases this floodway area, the red and blue area. It's a more restrictive area on the watercourse. And then the flood fringe area is that light blue area. The base flood elevation is the same, whether you're in the floodway or the flood fringe. And this area here, this light brownish oranges area, is actually the 500-year floodplain, or the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. We will not discuss how to calculate the 500-year flood elevations in this series. We really will just focus on that 100-year area. On our older paper maps, this is what the lakes will look like for an A zone. It will be this shaded gray area, and the watercourse will have that same shaded gray area. But some of the really old maps in the 70s, early 80s will have these dots that are the floodplain. So in both cases, the dots or the shaded gray area are our 100-year floodplain, or a 1% annual chance floodplain. For our older detailed maps, they will show that zone AE, E for elevation, and they'll show that rounded to the nearest foot elevation. That gray area is our 1% annual chance floodplain. And then in a detailed area, it will also break it into the floodway and the flood fringe, like we did for the digital maps. But for these older paper maps, the floodway will have this black line hatching here instead of the red and the blue colors. So this is all part of that 1% annual chance floodplain, and we'll have that same base flood elevation, whether you're in the floodway or the flood fringe. And then it also has the 500-year as that lighter gray area. And on the newer maps, that's called a shaded zone X. On the older maps, instead of being zone AE, it will have A with a number. That number is the number of half feet between the 10-year and the 100-year flood elevations, but it's that same color, that gray area. And the light gray area is going to be your zone, your 500-year zone, but it's called zone B in those older maps instead of the shaded zone X. The other change with those older maps is often the floodway, instead of having black hatching, will have a white area. That will be that restrictive floodway area. So you can see our videos in the other videos in the series about finding the base flood elevation, depending on if it's the detailed study lake, a detailed study watercourse, an approximate lake, or an approximate watercourse. Thanks for watching this video. If you'd like to learn more about the FEMA Map Service Center, you can go to that site using this QR code. And if you'd like to learn how to make a FEMA map on that Map Service Center site, see our Is My House in a Floodplain video. And we've got the QR code for that. To see other videos in our series on finding BFEs in Zone AE and Zone A, look below this video and you'll see this gray box and this More, If you click on that more or within the gray box, you'll get an expanded view, and we'll have links to the other videos in the series and other links to useful resources related to this topic. Again, thanks for listening.